Thank you so much for coming. And today is a festival. Darwin 26th Darwin Day celebration for reason for science. And this year for the butterfly, Darwin's birdwing butterfly. Oh no, sorry, Wallace butterfly. Birdwing butterfly. Today's speaker is Dr. James Costa, who is a professor of biology at the Western Carolina University. I did some research. It's about the same as ours, which is very nice. And he is an entomologist and evolutionary biologist working on insect conservation and invasive species, especially. And he's a prolific writer on especially about Darwin and Wallace. And he has received a lot of prestigious awards, including Alfred Russel Wallace Medal, Stephen J. Good Prize. That there was I attended his ceremony last year in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And he was also a prestigious Harvard Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies, and also fellow at Wissenschaft, Kellogg, TUA Berlin, the Berlin Institute of Advanced Studies as well. And he's also the Library of New York Botanical Garden, visiting scholar there, and also a visiting scholar at University of Hamburg in Germany, as well as University of Toulouse in France. And he has written a lot of books. I have some of them. I don't have the Wallace book with me today. I intended to get his signature. But I thought it would be in Montreal this year. Anybody going? I'm going, but he will have something else. I will miss him as well. But I have some other books like Darwin's Backyard. It's nice for you to work with your kids, whichever age, on these backyard projects. And I just saw a recent book about Darwin and the Art of Botany, recently published. Very, very nice. And he has a lot more. But today we are wonderful, glad to have him. And thank you so much for accepting our invitation to give us a talk about the second most important person of the 19th century about discovery of natural selection. Jim, your turn.
Yeah, thanks so much. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Nice introduction is much appreciated, and the invitation. I'm delighted to be here virtually and help you all celebrate Darwin Day. I'm going to share my screen here, see if I can get that to work. Can you all see that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, very good. Yeah, it's a special pleasure to have this opportunity to help you celebrate Darwin Day, Darwin's 215th birthday. And of course, Wallace would be delighted to be celebrating Darwin's birthday. And I think Darwin would be equally delighted, to have Wallace sort of here in a sense through me, sort of celebrating their their joint deep insight into the nature of the world. And of course, here I'm gonna focus on Wallace, and I wanted to maybe approach this in a way to help you maybe come to appreciate the multidimensional, the multitudinous, even Alfred Russel Wallace, very interesting figure in the history of our field. Because I had found over the years, that students, I think, of course, Darwin is a household name, but students, just too often rarely hear of Wallace. Maybe as a footnote in an introductory text, and certainly maybe a little bit more in an introductory evolutionary biology text. And I had reflected for some time how Wallace was such an interesting figure, so towering in his day, a towering figure in the 19th century, certainly the preeminent tropical biologist of his day. And we biologists, we honor him as the co-discoverer of natural selection. He's the discoverer of the Wallace line and articulating sort of a new way to understand biogeography, tying geographical distribution with Earth history. And delving in a little bit more deeply and learning more about this interesting figure, one comes to also appreciate that, boy, there are lots of other interesting dimensions. He becomes a spiritualist, he's a socialist, he's a social reform campaigner. He's got a lot going on besides just biology. But from a strictly kind of biological perspective, I thought it was remarkable that one of his stature, who had penned these landmark works that in some cases founded whole new fields, like his geographical distribution of animals, really articulating a new evolutionary biogeography, or Island Life, his 1880 book that helps us really see the beginnings of modern island biogeography, and often, just underappreciated and just not the depth of these insights too often not fully understood. And I think that in some measure that may be because of these other interests, these interests in economics and land reform, labor reform, ethics, spiritualism. He's clearly a very complicated character. And so over the years, I had, realized as a biologist, but also as an educator, that, it was curious. My students knew so little of this figure that had been really at the height of his game. By the end of his long life, he died at the age of 90 in 1913, just heaped with honors, honorary degrees, kudos, accolades galore. And of course, instrumental in establishing fundamental insights into the natural world in terms of evolution and biogeography. And yet, just so few have ever heard of him. He is perhaps, I think, the most famous scientist that no one has really ever heard of, except maybe, of course, for some of us biologists. We've heard a bit of him. So, I had really delved into Wallace's life and thought back in 2012, 2013, marking the centennial year of Wallace's death in 2013. I had published some analyses of Wallace's so-called species notebook, and I had published an analysis of Wallace's thinking in relation to Darwin's. 2013 really spawned kind of a whole renaissance of Wallace studies. So besides my own, couple of modest contributions, there were many other studies, and I came to thinking that for the 2023 bicentennial of Wallace's birth, that it was high time to perhaps synthesize these insights and try to understand Wallace in a fuller way, bringing to bear, many of the new insights that came from new resources, new notebooks discovered and digitized, the Wallace Correspondence Project online, lots of other interesting studies that have been published. So one of my interests has been, why is it that Wallace is so little known relative to his more famous friend and colleague Darwin? And I won't actually be answering that directly today. I won't be delving into that. That could easily be a whole other interesting talk, perhaps. Rather, what I'd like to do today, because I suspect that many of you maybe don't have much familiarity with these different facets of Wallace, I wanted to explore Wallace's rich and very complex life and thought, and maybe approach this in perhaps a somewhat non-traditional way. That is to say, instead of a very strict linear biography, I wanted to explore this by taking off on the theme of the Wallace line. This is one aspect of Wallace, one of Wallace's discoveries that many of you will be familiar with, the so-called Wallace line, the great line in a sense that kind of demarks two of the great biogeographical realms of the world, right? The Indo-Malayan and the Australasian realms. And we'll get back to Wallace's line, but I wanted to, for now, just kind of set the stage for this presentation by sort of sharing with you how I got to reflecting on how the idea of a line, and line in the context of border and boundary and frontier, that these sorts of themes, real and metaphorical, actually really define Wallace in so many ways. They crisscross his life in many interesting ways. And so my presentation will be somewhat biographical, but I wanted to give you a feel for the rich complexity of this guy by exploring his life as a life crisscrossed by lines, really. So I'm going to use this thematically: borders, boundaries, barriers, some of them very real and some of them rather metaphorical. And I think by the end of it, I hope that I'll have sort of piqued your curiosity. Maybe you'll want to delve in a bit more deeply. My book, Radical by Nature, is intended to be a kind of updated biography, but written for a fairly broad audience. So in a very conversational way, I'm trying to sort of tell the story of this very interesting person's life and its significance, especially for those of us in the sciences. So that's going to be my approach, and so taking this idea of borders and boundaries and lines, I will actually jump right in with the very beginning, Wallace's birth. He was born in a borderland, actually. He was born in the very small town of Usk in South Wales. I have the area circled here on this old map, and it's interesting to reflect on this as a borderland in a very real sense. This region of South Wales, and not far from the present border with England, actually it was disputed territory for centuries. So for some time it was considered part of England. For some time it was considered part of Wales. The border kind of shifted back and forth, and it might surprise you to hear that border was only settled as late as 1973, remarkably enough. And so Wallace, who's born to a middle-class family that was not doing very well economically, kind of moved repeatedly. The family eventually landed in South Wales, where the living was as cheap as possible, as his father reportedly said. And this is where Wallace, the eighth of nine children, was born, kind of a stranger in a strange land, kind of an interesting, an English lad, but born and raised, growing up in his very early childhood in Wales among the Welsh people. And I got to reflecting that this region is actually another kind of borderland as well, which I think resonates with what we know of Wallace in retrospect. It's not something that he would have known or could have appreciated, certainly, but it just so happens that Wallace was born atop a geological fault, which is pretty interesting. You can see on the geological map here on the left an interesting formation called the Usk Inlier. And the Usk Inlier is a great anticline. It's an upbuckling of the earth as a result of tectonic pressure. And the different rock types making up these different strata erode at different rates as they're exposed at the surface. And it leaves a kind of very distinctive pattern in the landscape that includes kind of flat areas punctuated by very, very sharp ridges. And in fact, Wallace is kind of born backed right up against one of these ridges. So this landscape of his early childhood is kind of a borderland twice over, both a political border and also a kind of geological border. He was born in the house in the very center of this photograph. It's called Kensington Cottage, privately owned today. And it's interesting to kind of reflect that that steep bank behind the house, the geology there is very different from the geology right across the river from the house there on the right side of this picture. Wallace in his very early childhood remembers scrambling up this bank, collecting fossils with his brothers. And so I can't help but think this is resonance somehow, born in a kind of borderland twice over. This curious topography kind of maybe shaping his nascent, very young awareness of just how curious the natural world can be. Right. So Wallace actually left us still in early childhood, about age of 5, moving to England, to Hartford, where he goes to school, but only until age 14. So the family continued to have economic problems. He's forced to leave school at 14 and help work, apprentice, and help support himself and also his family if he can. And so thereafter, we see Wallace both immersed in learning a trade, but also a period of self-education, right? Teaching himself, has a real penchant for reading and attending free lectures, typically in the mechanics institutes, where the forerunner of today's modern free libraries were available. Much of this time, though, he's working first as a builder, then as a surveyor, with the exception of a year at the age of 21 that he spent as a school teacher. And this brings me to another of these curious lines as we think about Wallace, this idea of him literally drawing lines for a living. For the better part of a decade, he worked as a professional, first an apprentice and then a professional surveyor and map maker. And it's interesting, during this time, he is taking part in a considerable kind of social shift in Britain at the time. This is the time of the enclosure laws, where formerly open common land is being enclosed and surveyed, and also the commutation of tithes, where much of the formerly land that was formerly occupied by tenants, with tenants who would pay in kind, such as milk or eggs or livestock or some such, and now they're forced to pay cash payments to the owners of the land. The owners are typically the church or the aristocracy. And in order to exact very accurately these cash payments, a great deal of surveying work was necessary. And so Wallace apprenticed first to his eldest brother, then working on his own after the death of his brother, is generating maps like these. These are a couple examples of Wallace's own survey maps. And it's resonant to think that here, on the one hand, as a young guy, Wallace is drawing all of these lines in a very literal way as a map maker and surveyor. But he doesn't realize that he's taking part in a kind of social movement that many saw as grossly unjust. And later in life, Wallace kind of looked back on that, and he came to realize the deep injustice of this dispossession of the people of the common land, and the hardships of the rural South Wales farmers of having to, suddenly pay their rents in cash instead of in kind, and the difficulties that this forced on these people. And so if we kind of fast forward to later in life, we see Wallace actively campaigning to erase those lines. And I mean in a very literal way, right? Wallace, from early on, he's sort of an Owenite socialist, right? As a young guy, as part of his kind of program of self-education and self-improvement, he's reading, writings of the great Welsh reformer, Robert Owen, who has grand social experiments in communal living, kind of like, co-ops on a grand scale, like New Lanark in Scotland and New Harmony in Indiana here in the US. He's ultimately writing books like the ones you see on the left here, Land Nationalization. He starts to campaign for nationalizing the land, literally abolishing private ownership of land, erasing those lines. And this other book, The Revolt of Democracy, is Wallace's scathing criticism of his culture, of this culture of what he saw as greed and oppression of the working people, right? So he's championing the dispossessed here. And so these are another kind of line that we can see, in a sense, Wallace sort of drawing and then erasing. And another kind of line maybe has to do with Wallace's cultivation of this taste for science. It happens just by chance, fortuitously, in 1844, when he worked for 1 year as a school teacher. He happened to meet a local guy named Bates, Henry Bates, who introduced him to entomology. They're about the same age, and Bates is very keen on collecting beetles and other insects. And he really gets, his buddy Alfred, really excited about this. And it sort of helps kind of cultivate or engender a taste for science, a taste for nature, and these questions about species really, and variation and their distribution and all of those sorts of things. Right. And many of you, of course, as biologists, will recognize Bates's name in Batesian mimicry. So the two of them went on to illustrious careers, and it really got its start there in Leicester. And we can kind of thank Bates for having turned Wallace on to this aspect of natural history. It's known pretty well by the documentary record, by Wallace's letters that survive at the time and other writings, what he was interested in, right? So we see this taste for science, and in the Mechanics Institute's libraries, Wallace is reading, travel narratives like Alexander von Humboldt's, personal narrative. He's reading the exciting, new principles of geology by Charles Lyell, this exciting new way of understanding Earth history. He reads Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle and is very excited. I think that, Darwin, of course, had also read Humboldt and read Lyell. Darwin himself, he's 14 years older than Wallace, but Darwin himself, as a younger man, was fired up by this idea of scientific travel, traveling to exotic, distant locales, and maybe contributing something to the growth of scientific knowledge. And we see Wallace kind of following in his footsteps, and it's resonant that Wallace read Darwin himself. So Darwin in turn helped to inspire Wallace to want to do this. So we see him reading inspiring scientific luminaries, but the record also shows that at the same time, he's going deeper and deeper into political matters, economic matters. He's interested in philosophical issues, ethical issues. He delves into, as I mentioned, Robert Owen, the reformer. He also notes the impact that Thomas Paine's Age of Reason had on him. So he's really imbibing a really eclectic range of books from the sciences to philosophy and ethics. And in some cases, the kind of the scientific and the sort of social revolutionary intersect. And so, for example, we know that Wallace read this incendiary book, and that is The Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. By 1845, this book had come out already in its third edition. It was a bestseller, and it was published anonymously in 1844 by Robert Chambers, who turned out to be the author. He's the Scottish publisher and author. And Chambers published this book anonymously, probably knowing that it might ruin him easily financially, right? This was a kind of proto-evolutionary tract, which was speculated wildly about evolutionary themes from the cosmic to the planetary, all the way down to species changing, but also the ideas of societies changing, political change. And that was perhaps a little bit too close to political revolution in the minds of some. So this sensational book was also considered to be an incredibly scandalous book. And, Wallace, it says something about his sort of taste for the unorthodox, his willingness to give a hearing to sort of fringe ideas, that it's clear from his letters that upon reading this book at the age of 22, he was immediately convinced the author was right? He became convinced of the reality of this heretical idea of transmutation, which is what, at the time, what we know as evolution was called. But more than that, the audacity here, Wallace was actually determined that he would like to investigate this profound question about transmutation or evolution. I say audacious because, again, think about that, right? Here's a young guy whose formal education ended at 14, who's a working man, really. He's trained as a surveyor. He's self-educated, right, in these free libraries, but he has no social standing, no institutional connections, no money to speak of, no nothing. And yet he's kind of dreaming big, dreaming big. And that's really characteristic of Wallace. It's really quite interesting. In fact, he's dreaming so big that in his correspondence with his buddy Bates, we find in letters that survive that he talks specifically with Bates about the vestiges. And then in another letter, he wrote to Bates that he would like to study some one widely distributed insect family, right, on a global scale. And he's very explicit in the letter. You see the fragment here at lower left. He says, principally, he wants to do this with a view to the theory of the origin of species, right? He's very explicit about this. He's fired up about this idea of transmutation. He says, by that means, I'm strongly of opinion some definite results might be arrived at. So this is kind of, really fascinating to me that the young Wallace and the young Bates, again, with no prospects, no real finances or formal education to speak of, they sort of concoct this plan to travel in the footsteps of the likes of Humboldt or Darwin to explore exotic, distant, locales teeming with diversity. They wanted to travel to the tropics. And here we see them as travelers and crossers of lines of another sort, meridians and parallels, against all odds. They find themselves in South America, just 6 months after writing that last letter that I quoted from. These two guys managed to bum their way across the Atlantic Ocean. It's just really astonishing if you think about it, right? And they are in paradise, right? They are traveling in Humboldt's footsteps, in Darwin's footsteps. They feel they're studying biodiversity, distribution of species, local geology, local people, copious observations, copious specimens. The scheme is to collect materials and ship them back to the UK with instructions to the agent that they are working with to save all of their materials except the duplicates. The duplicates can be sold to wealthy collectors or museums. The money would get sent back to them in Brazil, and this would fund the expedition, right? This is the plan. So it's really quite audacious and incredibly productive, right? Wallace spent ultimately 4 years in the Amazon. Bates ended up spending 11 years, and it's interesting to see that even there we see Wallace employing his skills as a surveyor, right? As he's traveling up the Rio Negro and Rio Wapice, we see him surveying as he goes. When later he actually drafted this very detailed, what I'm showing you here is a fragment of a very large, hand-drawn, very detailed map of the Amazon, the Rio Negro, and the Rio Wapice. And this is all from Wallace's own surveying, right? He has nothing. He's traveling by canoe. He's got, a sextant and a watch and a chain, a surveyor's chain, and that's it, and he actually manages to produce this incredibly accurate map that was ultimately published and really stood the test of time until well into the 20th century. Pretty amazing accomplishment. We also find him reveling in natural history, drawing, for example, freshwater fishes of these river basins. We find him living among the local people, trying to learn their languages, compiling vocabularies, drawing artifacts. Here we have one of the great Moluccas that he stayed in, sketches of the forest. Wallace would have produced, we suspect from letters that where he has mentioned the drawings he had been working on, that he probably generated several hundred of these drawings. He was planning on writing a book on the palms, a book on the fish, but most of them sadly never made it right back to England. And this kind of speaks to another kind of line that Wallace is always kind of very tenuously kind of dancing on, and that's this line between life and death. And in a very literal way, right? I mean, Wallace is traveling under the most arduous conditions. At times, he's utterly prostrated with disease. At one time, his friend Richard Spruce really thought he was going to die. Wallace's younger brother had come out to the Amazon later to help him out, found it didn't suit him, decided to head back to England, never made it, right? Was felled by yellow fever. He's faced with human traffickers, with pirates, with dangerous animals, like jaguars. And, it's just, there are all sorts of very good reasons why Wallace, very easily might have lost his life in these travels. Um, he survived those 4 years. And finally, at the end of that time, really coming off of another very severe bout of malaria, he decides it's time to go home. And he packs up his notebooks, all of his artwork. He has almost 2 years of specimens. He has a live menagerie that he thinks will be, just really help make his name in scientific London. 1852, he's finally heading home, and then almost loses his life again when his ship burns in the middle of the Atlantic, right? Several weeks out, mid-Atlantic, this ship burned very quickly. They had barely any time to save anything. No lives were lost, fortunately. Everyone managed to get out into one of the little leaky lifeboats where Wallace was adrift for about 10 days before they were very luckily picked up by a passing ship. Very lucky. But in the process, we had, Wallace really reflecting on the fact that really everything was lost, right? All of his notebooks from 4 years, virtually all of his artwork, the few drawings that I showed you, that's just part of one small packet that he was able to save before making it to the lifeboat. And of course, all the poor live animals that he had that he thought would make his name in the scientific salons of London. And we see this is perhaps the most trying of tests for Wallace. And it also, at the same time, adversity also shows you other sides of people's personality. And so I always found it really pretty telling and also kind of amusing that when Wallace recounts this, horrific ordeal, one of the things he really emphasizes is that, as difficult as it was, he was really in an ideal position to observe meteors, lying on his back in a small boat in the Atlantic was just the ideal setting, right? And that's classic Wallace. He's always kind of looking at that glass as half full. He's looking on the positive side. And although repeatedly he's knocked down, he's constantly, got that spirit to get up, and brush himself off and forge on ahead, right? And that forging on ahead really carried him through, even after arriving home in England and being reunited with his mom. You see on the left in this photo, his sister in the middle of this photo, nursed back to health. We see Wallace vowing that he will never trust himself on the ocean again, right? After just narrowly surviving that ordeal. But then, of course, just a year and a half later, off he goes, right? And maybe because he had lost everything, we know from other writings, he had been thinking about questions about species origins. And he actually had a kind of a theory of the relationship between geological phenomena and new species. And there are some hints of this given in some papers that Wallace published in that one intervening year that he was home before heading east. And so he heads east. He heads to the Great Malay Archipelago as they knew it then. This is mostly modern day Indonesia, but extending from peninsular Malaysia, kind of far in the west here, all the way across to New Guinea. This just, tremendous, continental scale archipelago with islands, both great and small, just myriad islands in this archipelago. And fortunately for us, right, Wallace's notebooks and other writings from this time, they survive. And I had the privilege some years ago, I mentioned my work that was published back in 2013. I studied this notebook, the species notebook of Wallace's, fascinating notebook that he kept while traveling the Malay Archipelago, a notebook in which he confided many of his speculations about the nature and indeed the origin of species, and this idea of transmutation and evidence for it. We even see evidence in this notebook that Wallace was planning to write a book on this subject, right? So I like to emphasize to my students and others, Wallace formerly was mistaken as simply a collector who perhaps got lucky and maybe blundered into discovering the principle of natural selection or cottoned on to this pattern that's called the Wallace line. And I think, nothing can be further than from the truth. In fact, what we see in the documentary record is that Wallace was keen to travel, not to be a collector, but to be what would have been called then a philosophical naturalist, right? A scientist, right? He's pursuing grand questions, right? The mystery of species origins. The collecting was a means to an end, right? Funding those expeditions. I think it's very important to bear that in mind. And while we're on the theme of lines, this is, of course, not long after arriving in the East that Wallace does discover this great kind of faunal discontinuity that we call the Wallace line today. Again, fortuitously, but Wallace is one that has an eye to pattern. He begins to notice interesting patterns and something maybe that doesn't seem quite right and begin to kind of connect those dots, And Wallace was keen on traveling east in the archipelago, but there's no traveling directly in any one to any between any two locales. You have to go to like major ports and kind of zigzag your way across the archipelago. And so he traveled from his initial base in Sarawak in Borneo down to the island of Bali, where he does some collecting, and then travels across the very narrow strait to the island of Lombok. And there he notices a tremendous difference in the fauna, especially the birds and the mammals, not just differences in species or genera, but I mean whole families are different, which is really quite remarkable, right? You have two islands side by side. You can see them from each other. They're virtually the same size. They're environmentally and geologically virtually identical, and yet, the mammalian and the avifauna are radically different. So he realizes something very interesting is going on here. And we sort of recognize that as Wallace started to follow out how far you could see this difference as he sort of maps out differences between islands in the archipelago, he begins to piece together the explanation that is not very far from a modern understanding, which is to say a relationship between the depth of the ocean, time, isolation, divergence, right? Wallace, of course, lived at a time when there was not a tectonic understanding of Earth history, right? So there's no idea of plate tectonics or continental drift. There is movement up and down mainly. And that sufficed really to give Wallace a deep insight into the way paleoclimate and shifting land levels and sea levels are at play here in determining whether islands can be united with continental areas or remain isolated, for example. So here we see Wallace kind of tracing out the Wallace line. He didn't call it that. It was dubbed the Wallace line by Huxley in the late 1860s in Wallace's honor. And in fact, this whole region is today often referred to by biogeographers as Wallacea. Right? This is the Great Wallacean region. Right. So this is one of Wallace's great contributions to modern biological understanding of the world. Not long after this initial discovery, we also find him making another major contribution to biological understanding of the world. And that is where he actually is kind of crossing another line, breaking down another barrier, and that is the species barrier, right? Living at a time when, the mainstream naturalists and others do not accept the idea of transmutation or evolution, do not accept that species can change. They're all, created and remain as we see them. But Wallace is convinced otherwise. And we see him in 1858, halfway through his 8-year stay in these islands, in a malarial fit, right? He suddenly has this flash of insight into the mechanism that Darwin had long since discovered and called natural selection, right? So here we have Wallace realizing in his ill, semi-delirious state, this idea, very exciting idea. And he recounts how, as soon as he was well enough, he wrote out the idea. The discovery is made on the island of Halmahera. And as soon as he was able to get back to his base on the neighboring small island of Ternate, which is a major port and trading center in that area, he wrote out a fair copy of this idea, and he titled it On the Tendency of Varieties to Depart Indefinitely from the Original Type. Right, this is the so-called Ternate essay to biologists and historians today. And of course, of all people to send it to, he sent it to Charles Darwin, right? The two had been corresponding over questions about the nature of species and varieties. And that title will suggest to you that's exactly the way Wallace is envisioning this, the nature of varieties and how they can become increasingly dissimilar from that parental original sort of type, if you will. So Wallace mails his essay to Darwin in March of 1858. Likely arrived like a bombshell about mid-June at Down House. Darwin's friends, Charles Lyell, Joseph Hooker, the botanist, they hastily arrange what has been called a delicate arrangement of the joint reading of Wallace's essay, along with unpublished writings of Darwin's at the Linnean Society of London. This is the first big public announcement of the principle of natural selection, July 1st, 1858. Wallace doesn't know anything about this, of course, but he finds out soon enough, and Darwin is under pressure to really come forward with his own fully developed ideas, right, to maintain his priority. He publishes On the Origin of Species about a year and a half later. And, one might think that Wallace would be just bitterly disappointed, and maybe even very upset, that here he had sort of gotten there first in a way, and yet he was immediately kind of shunted to the back seat by Darwin's friends, But in fact, he did not feel that way. I mean, Wallace had nothing but, the strongest, most ardent admiration for Darwin and the origin. Even in places where you would expect if he has any misgivings, he would reveal them, like in private letters to his family. You might think, oh, maybe he'll, say a little something there. But no, even in those letters, he's genuine in his generous spirit, really, his magnanimity, and his hat is off to Darwin in this case. Much more could be said about that episode that I don't have time to go into, but it's quite fascinating. It says a lot about Wallace's personality and also maybe partly why Wallace is somewhat eclipsed today relative to his friend Darwin. But I want to just continue for now this exploration of lines and borders and boundaries, because I just described for you how Wallace had smashed through the species barrier, right? Had come up with this idea for how species can change. Species are not immutable. Species are not permanent, right? And he realized that this is even true of humans. At the time, he believed, humans too can be understood in this context. And so in this context, we see Wallace actually thinking about things in a remarkable way. I mean, depth of insight that really even blew Darwin away. In 1864, 2 years after Wallace finally arrived home, that was 1862. This time, no mishaps, right? He's famous, right? He's hailed as a major thinker and contributor to scientific thought. One of his many papers of the mid 1860s, he proposes this incredible model of human evolution. And it's basically a two-phased model of human evolution where natural selection shapes humans bodily in human divergence from a primate common ancestor, right, with our closest primate relatives. But then at some point, selection begins to operate more and more almost exclusively on the human mind. And the body is almost in a freeze frame while the mind continues to develop, and our exquisite cognitive capacity develops in this way. And Darwin is really pretty amazed by this. He writes to Wallace, the great leading idea is new to me, right? During late ages, the mind would have been modified more than the body. Um, Now, one expression of Darwin's admiration for this idea is that he actually worked it into the Descent of Man, right? In 1871, Darwin's own take on human evolution, he worked Wallace's theory of this two-phase model of the way selection works into that book, in fact. So we see in this period Wallace just truly ascendant, just really very much part of, very central to the Darwinian circle, scientific society. And then, something curious happens, right? No sooner did Wallace seem to like smash through that line between, species and tear down the barrier that people saw between humans and other species, thinking humans are special, he suddenly sort of re-erected that barrier. And that seemed like a very strange kind of about face to Wallace's friends in the scientific community, including Darwin, of course. Um, the way I think of that is we see Wallace sort of changing his mind over mind, right? And this is clearly tied to his growing interest in the spiritualist movement, right? And in the spiritualist movement, he's beginning to sort of think that there are other sort of realms of reality out there, not simply the strictly physical realm that we're used to. There may be other planes of existence, and that it may be possible to communicate between them. And this kind of leads him down this very curious path. And so, for example, he came to argue that, if you want to be a very strict Darwinian, Wallacean gradualist, right, where everything evolves by slow, stepwise, gradual evolution, where every step has its own use, right, in its time and place, and is adaptive, he points to the mind and says the mind doesn't fit the pattern, right? If the most complex mental faculties are present in all humans, including those that live and maybe ancestrally have always lived in an extremely so-called primitive state, right? Think about maybe hunter-gatherer societies, perhaps, right? And yet those people, right, have exactly the same complex mental faculties as anyone else. Well, then this sort of flies in the face of the idea of a stepwise gradualism for the evolution of mind, right? And this is just one of several arguments that Wallace is making to kind of undermine his former belief that the human mind was shaped by natural selection. Darwin, as you can imagine, is extremely upset with Wallace. He writes to him, "I hope you've not murdered too completely your own and my child," he says. And then he follows up with another letter. He says, you expected, I differ grievously from you. I'm very sorry for it." This was a serious, serious strain on their friendship, although it never did break their friendship completely. But you can imagine that Darwin and the other leading scientists of the day in this circle, Hooker and Huxley and Lyell and others, they're flummoxed, right? They just can't understand what in the world, having seen, just the depth and breadth of Wallace's thought when it came to biogeography and evolution. They couldn't understand this sudden turn towards spiritualism. And so, we sort of see this uneasy coexistence of Wallace on two sides of a curious line, right? He is, on the one hand, the first Darwinian, right? He is, in fact, when he lectured in the US, he lectured coast to coast, from Boston to California, acclaimed lecturer, right? He was declared by newspapers in Boston to be the first Darwinian, right? This is in the 1880s. And he emerges as the most devastatingly effective defender of his ideas with Darwinism, Wallaceism, right? He's an incredibly original thinker, not only natural selection and those ideas about biogeography we talked about, Wallace originates the modern understanding of aposematic coloration, right? Warning coloration. He articulates the modern understanding of reinforcement in speciation, an idea that Darwin wasn't so sure about. He sort of sparred with Darwin over sexual selection, and I think it's fair to say that the modern benefits model, kind of honest signaling or good genes or however you want to look at it, these modern models of sexual selection are absolutely closer to Wallace's view than Darwin's view of how sexual selection works, right? So we see him on so many counts, all through the 1860s, 70s, 80s. He is on the one hand the first Darwinian, right? But he's also, kind of a pain in the butt, right? He's definitely a thorn in the side of the scientific establishment, also the political establishment, right? He becomes an ardent advocate for spiritualism. He attacks compulsory smallpox vaccination. He writes these odd letters to the editor, criticizing public support for natural history museums of all things, right? John Stuart Mill, the philosopher, invited him to become the founding president of the Land Nationalization Society, and he took this very seriously. And every year he wrote long addresses, and he's constantly campaigning for land and labor reform, as I alluded to near the beginning of my talk. So how do we understand Wallace kind of existing kind of one foot on either side of this sort of metaphorical line, if you will? Well, he didn't see a line in a sense. He is a humanitarian, right? He is a good scientist, but he's also a humanitarian. And I see him in that process assailing another line, right? Another border, another barrier. And that is the poverty and discrimination barrier. We see Wallace more and more, even as he's penning acclaimed scientific papers and books. We also see him writing more and more polemical books and articles and giving interviews, arguing for labor reform, land reform, women's rights to vote, all of these sorts of things. This is on the left, one of his calling cards, and you see where he's written, wishing yourself in the cause of socialism, every success, he says. And in fact, in the late 1880s, he was very explicit in declaring himself, and I quote, a thorough socialist, he says. So he was really a lifelong Owenite socialist, right? One who really was very communitarian and egalitarian, promoting kind of a co-op model, perhaps, of a social structure, to now becoming an out and out socialist. And he's writing, really vitriolic broadsides against the establishment, like the statement you see here from his autobiography, right? To allow one child to be born a millionaire and another a pauper is a crime, he says, against humanity. And in really a dig to what he saw as the hypocrisy of the establishment kind of religious community, right? Because church and state are one, right, in Britain. He says it's a crime against God, right? These are, these strong words are just indicative of the passion that Wallace feels for these issues, right? And so, he sort of uneasily coexists in these worlds. On the one hand, again, breaking through social barriers, right? As a young guy, working man, surveyor, builder, school teacher, self-taught naturalist. Towards the end, of his long life, kudos and accolades heaped upon him, honorary degrees, medals, the highest honor that the crown can bestow, right? The Order of Merit that only a finite number of living people can hold at any one time. When Wallace visits the U.S., he's invited to the White House, right? You kind of imagine that he's gone from like the most humble of origins to really at the very apex, right, of intellectual society. And yet he's not happy with this. He doesn't want really the honors, the degrees. He turns down some honorary degrees. We see him reluctantly, actually, at the age of 70, inducted into the Royal Society, right? The most august of the scientific societies of Britain at the time. And in fact, he was inducted so late that the Royal Society was criticized for this, given, the how illustrious his contributions had been. How could they possibly wait until he was, 70 years old to elect him membership? And so here you see reproduced a letter to the editor of the Times written by George Darwin. This is Charles Darwin's son, right? By now, Charles had died. And George rallies to the defense of the Royal Society, saying it's only just to state it's notorious Mr. Wallace would have been elected any time in the last 35 years if he had ever allowed himself to be nominated, right? So that speaks volumes, right? That is Wallace all those years saying, no, 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 I don't want it. I don't want the honors. I don't want the spotlight. I don't want the accolades. He's interested in the ideas and his causes and throwing himself into those, right? So I'm going to just sort of wrap up here with this, kind of broad strokes kind of exploration of these interesting facets of the complex personality that is Wallace. I'm going to close by maybe stepping back and kind of looking at this through the lens of Gilbert Chesterton. This is a quote from Chesterton that I had come across years ago, and I always found it amusing when I first read this. I was like, wow, what a cool idea. Chesterton wrote in 1904 that if he were asked who should be regarded in the future as the greatest man, right, quote unquote, of our time, right, greatest person, he says he would hesitate between Walt Whitman, and Alfred Russel Wallace. I thought, wow, now that is a fascinating juxtaposition. And as I thought about that, I realized that now I don't know that Chesterton had this in mind, but I remembered Whitman's sense of a truly expansive vision of himself in relation to the world. And I love this little passage from Song of Myself from 1855, where Whitman says, "Do I contradict myself? Very well then. I contradict myself, right? I am large. I contain multitudes." And I thought, if Chesterton did not have this in mind, he should have, right? This is exactly, I see the deep resonance between this expression of Whitman's spirit and what I came to appreciate as Wallace's spirit. And so the two, I think, yes, radical and revolutionary in their respective ways are certainly apt descriptors. And I think certainly multitudinous comes to mind. The two even look a lot alike. Look at that. That's pretty interesting. And so I hope this has given you maybe some new appreciation for the multitudinous Wallace, and maybe whet your appetite a bit to learn a little bit more, maybe delve in and really come to better understand what makes Wallace tick, his various interests, and how he saw how he saw them kind of harmoniously interweave together in a fascinating way. And with that, I just want to say, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. I only wish I could be there in person and not simply virtually among you. It's a pleasure to help celebrate Darwin's birthday with you. Thanks. I can stop my.
Questions. Thank you so much, Jim. Yeah. Any questions?
Very welcome.
Was Wallace a deist or the opposite?
Yeah. Okay.
Is the question, was Wallace a deist?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I would say early on, he considered himself to be an atheist. Then later, through his interest in spiritualism, he's no kind of orthodox sort of religious thinker. He went through some phases, and I would say that deism might be one of them. But it's interesting that in his latest writings, he seemed to be more overtly invoking a kind of theistic evolutionism that he never really believed, I think, in a really personal God. So deism is probably the closest to it. But I see more and more he was moving in those very late years towards something more conventionally sort of within that theistic evolution Christian worldview, I suspect.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
Well, I have one. Because at that time you have the Great Britain and France were in the sort of turmoil. France had this Third Republic and influenced by the earlier thinkers like Wallace, St. Simon, and in England there was Robert Owen. And did he ever join the socialist parties at that time for Wallace?
No, I think he corresponded with like-minded, sort of socialistically minded folks abroad. Didn't join them in any sort of literal or meaningful way. I don't, to my knowledge, never sort of elected a foreign member of a group abroad in France or elsewhere. But there was quite a network of people interested in these causes at the time. And thanks to the Wallace Correspondence Project, which is now online, Wallace's letters are available through Epsilon, through Cambridge University Library freely. It's really exciting. It is kind of neat. You can search these letters and kind of read his correspondence, including on this subject, with far-flung correspondence, kind of commiserating in some cases, and his position is one of not simply sort of socialism, period. It's kind of related to broader issues for him. He takes a very firm anti-war stance. He's calling for radical economic reform. Some economists actually point to him as an early advocate for certain forms of economic reform that were realized in the 20th century. And a couple of economists actually kind of credit Wallace with these ideas. The correspondence is a great way, I think, to get a sense of his correspondence with such people.
Thank you. Yeah. But at that time, also, Karl Marx and Frederick Engels were in England, and they were still alive. And did he have any contact with them? But they were less famous at that time, of course.
Yeah, not to my knowledge. Not to my knowledge. Interesting new things are sort of fairly regularly coming to light. There may be something interesting that will arise. I think that by virtue of Wallace's stature as a biologist, his name and his word, right, his positions carried a lot of weight when he weighed in on social issues. And so chances are they knew of him. Now, this is not to say that Wallace was a truly original kind of thinker about these things. He would have these interests, and then he would develop them. He would kind of make them his own, maybe put his own kind of spin on them, and then run with that ball. So the chances are, maybe Engels, Marx, others, may have known of Wallace, but because he wasn't sort of a sustained thinker and writer in just this area, but he's really sort of all over the place. It would be interesting to know to what extent they took him seriously, other than respecting him as given his stature. Certainly that's true of his work in women's suffrage, the way he sort of took that idea, inspired by socialist writing initially, and then adapting a version of sexual selection as an argument for women's legal and economic rights, and kind of giving that a unique Wallacean stamp, and then really running with that. So anyway, long answer to a short question. Sorry.
Thank you. Oh, there's another.
Beginning, you mentioned the slides mentioned that he declined honorary degree, Cambridge and somewhere else. You know why he declined those? Or sort of anti whatever they were standing for?
It's difficult to hear that question. Someone may need to, closer to the screen, may need to repeat it.
At another university, do you know why?
The question is,
Oh.
he declined honorary degrees from University of Cambridge and other universities. Why did he decline that?
Yeah, he really is what I call the reluctant honoree. It wasn't like for a political statement or anything, it was more like, he really was happiest in his garden and his study, and thinking about these things, and he enjoyed spending time with his family. I think he just genuinely didn't want the fanfare, and he was really only very reluctantly did he accept an honorary degree from Oxford, and then others like Huxley had to personally intervene and prevail upon him to accept the nomination for the Royal Society. He just would not have done it. And they ultimately convinced him that if someone of his stature turned it down, it would be a great black mark on the reputation of the Royal Society, and it would hurt the cause of science in Britain, and they kind of got to him that way. So that's I think what's at play with his turning down Cambridge for the honorary degree. He just wasn't interested in honors.
Well, the questions can go on forever. Thank you so much, Jim. And let's give Jim another line.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated. I'm happy to be with you.
Yeah, and happy Darwin's Day. And we are going to have some celebration afterwards.
All right, great. Save me a piece of Darwin Day cake.
You can have digital one.
Digital one, yeah.
We send you electrons. Thank you, Jim.
Very-
I hope I will
Take
see
care.
you online.
Very good. I'll look forward to it. Yes.
Yeah, thank you.